Have you ever looked a predator dead in the eye and realized he mistook you for his weakest prey? I have. It is a strange thrill when their blind arrogance becomes the exact weapon you use to destroy them. The fools who think they hold 100% of the power never realize the grave they dug is already lined with spikes meant for them. Buckle up. This is not a tragedy of endurance, but a ruthless reverse hunt. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Aurora Olson. It was exactly 14 minutes past 2 in the morning when the nightmare began. A massive tropical storm was tearing through the Miami coastline, throwing relentless sheets of rain against my apartment windows. The wind howled outside like a wounded animal, but it was the piercing ring of my cell phone that truly shattered the dead of the night. The caller ID flashed in the dark, displaying my twin sister's name, Clara. When I answered, her voice was not just shaking, it was vibrating with a primal terror. She was not crying over a broken heart or complaining about another petty marital argument. Instead, her words spilled out in a frantic, breathless rush. Julian, her impossibly charming and wealthy husband, was orchestrating a terrifying campaign. He was actively trying to convince their mutual friends, their family, and even their doctors that Clara was losing her mind. He was painting her as a victim of severe paranoid delusions. He says I am imagining things. Aurora, Clara gasped, her breath catching painfully in her throat. He tells everyone I am suffering from psychosis, but I am not crazy. I swear to you, I am not. My passwords keep changing on their own. My own fingerprint will not unlock my personal tablet anymore, and my phone, GPS. It keeps showing that I am miles away from where I actually am. When I confront him, he just looks at me with this sickening pity, telling me I need heavy medication. He is deliberately making me doubt my own sanity. I sat up straight, the cold dread instantly sobering me. I work as a senior data audit and systems recovery specialist for Vanguard Cybernetics. I spend my days dismantling complex digital infrastructures, tracing encrypted corporate footprints, and hunting down invisible saboteurs. I know the anatomy of a digital hijack better than I know my own heartbeat. What my sister was describing was not a technical glitch. It was a methodical, highly targeted cyber manipulation. Julian was systematically gaslighting her using the very smart home ecosystem she trusted to keep her safe. The danger she was currently in had nothing to do with physical violence. The real threat was buried deep in algorithms and server access logs. Listen to me very carefully. Clara, I said, keeping my voice utterly flat and commanding, do not argue with him tonight. Do not try to prove you are sane. I need you to walk out of that house right now. Leave your phone on the kitchen counter. Do not take your smartwatch or your credit cards. Grab whatever cash you have. Walk 3 blocks down to the main avenue and flag down a yellow cab. Tell the driver to take you to a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. Pay only in cash. Do not contact anyone else. I will find you when it is done. I hung up immediately, throwing on a dark waterproof jacket and grabbing my encrypted laptop bag. Within 5 minutes, I was behind the wheel of my SUV, tearing through the flooded, empty streets of Miami. The torrential rain was blinding, but my mind was possessed by a singular focus. I was heading straight into the belly of the beast Julian's ultra-luxurious smart mansion located in Coral Gables. I needed to extract the raw network logs from his home server before he realized Clara was gone and wiped the entire system clean. It took me 45 minutes of treacherous driving to reach the gated community. I parked my vehicle 2 streets away, concealed under the dripping canopy of ancient banyan trees, and approached the massive property on foot. The mansion loomed in the dark like a modern fortress. I bypassed the front gate security using a custom-built signal cloner, slipping through the side entrance like a shadow in the rain. Once I was inside the perimeter, a bone-chilling realization washed over me. I tapped into the local wireless network using my handheld diagnostic tool to map out the security feeds. Out of the 24 high-definition cameras installed around the sprawling estate, exactly 18 had been deliberately disabled from the master control panel. The only cameras still actively recording were positioned at highly specific, peculiar angles. They exclusively covered the top of the grand marble staircase, the slippery edge of the backyard infinity pool, and the slick tile floor of the master bathroom. These were not random security blind spots. They were meticulously planned stages. Julian was not just trying to drive my twin sister insane to lock her away in a psychiatric ward. He was actively preparing a flawless digital alibi. He was setting up the perfect, fatal accident. The disabled cameras ensured there would be no witnesses to the actual event, while the active ones would capture just enough footage to prove he was nowhere near her when she supposedly slipped and broke her neck. My blood turned to ice, but the coldness quickly morphed into a burning, unstoppable rage. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a fragile woman. He had no idea he had just invited a merciless digital executioner into his home. I slipped through the heavy oak side door of the mansion, using the 6-digit emergency override code Clara had memorized years ago. The interior of the massive house was suffocatingly quiet, a stark and eerie contrast to the raging tempest still tearing apart the coastline outside. The central air conditioning hummed softly, continuously circulating the sterile, artificial scent of expensive leather furniture and citrus room spray. I moved silently down the long, shadowed hallway, meticulously keeping my footsteps light against the imported Brazilian hardwood floors. I slipped into the master suite just long enough to grab one of my sister's emerald green silk robes from the edge of the perfectly unmade bed. I quickly shrugged off my soaked, dark, waterproof jacket, wrapped the cool, flowing silk tightly around my shoulders, and pulled the hair tie from my head, letting my long, dark hair fall completely loose around my face. To anyone standing in the shadows of the house, the physical silhouette was absolutely identical. I crept silently down the hall and entered Julian's private home office. It was a deeply masculine, imposing room entirely dominated by a massive, custom-built tempered glass desk and floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves. I did not dare reach for the brass light switch. Relying entirely on the faint, bluish glow of my laptop screen, I knelt quietly behind his massive, high-backed leather chair, successfully located the primary network-attached storage drive hidden beneath the floorboards, and plugged in my decryption cable. The extraction software immediately sprang to life, initiating a relentless brute force protocol against the advanced 256-bit encryption guarding his master directory. The progress bar began its agonizingly slow crawl across my monitor. 5%, 10%. It felt exactly like wading waist-deep through thick, freezing mud. I carefully monitored the thermal output of my processing unit, knowing any sudden spike in temperature could easily trigger an automated digital failsafe on his end. 15%, 20%. Then, the unmistakable, incredibly heavy thud of the solid mahogany front door echoing loudly through the massive foyer completely shattered the delicate silence of the house. My heart slammed violently against my ribs with the raw force of a sledgehammer. It was barely 3 o'clock in the morning. Julian was absolutely not supposed to be home until sunrise. Heavy, remarkably uneven footsteps stomped loudly across the imported marble entrance. The sharp metallic clinking of a dropped keychain hitting the floor was immediately followed by a muted, furious string of curses. The stench of him arrived moments before he actually did. A nauseating, invisible wave of aged Scotch whiskey violently mixed with the sour tang of nervous sweat and overwhelmingly expensive designer cologne. This was not the smooth, calculated, predatory stride of a man entirely in control of his domain. This was the erratic, highly destructive pacing of a man who had just suffered a catastrophic financial loss. A desperate, cornered gambler whose high-stakes bluff had finally been called out by his creditors. The heavy footsteps grew significantly louder, more aggressive, marching with terrifying purpose straight toward the home office. I remained perfectly still in his high-backed leather chair, my back completely turned toward the open doorway. The delicate silk robe draped perfectly over my shoulders. The data transfer hit exactly 75%. I needed exactly 45 more seconds. Julian stormed violently into the office. He did not even bother reaching for the wall switch to turn on the lights. The only illumination came from the jagged, blinding forks of lightning flashing violently through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, monstrous, distorted shadows across the expensive Persian rugs. He yanked off his tailored Italian suit jacket and hurled it carelessly onto a nearby velvet reading chair, carelessly knocking over a crystal whiskey decanter in the process. He marched directly toward the heavy glass desk, his breathing incredibly harsh, heavy, and ragged. He reached aggressively into his inner breast pocket and slammed a thick, legally bound document onto the glass surface right in front of me. The incredibly loud smack vibrated intensely through the heavy furniture. "Sign it," he barked, his voice thick with hard liquor and boiling, uncontrollable rage. "I am absolutely not playing your pathetic games tonight. Clara, sign the damn medical power of attorney right now. My corporate lawyers need this filed with the state by exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, and I am entirely sick of your endless, pathetic weeping." I did not move a single muscle. I kept my chin tucked low against my chest, deliberately letting the thick curtain of my dark hair completely obscure my facial profile. Beneath the desk, the encrypted USB drive blinked furiously in the absolute dark. 88%, 92. Julian let out a sharp, aggressively exasperated breath. The absolute silence in the room seemed to infuriate his narcissistic ego even more. He stepped dangerously closer, aggressively invading my personal space, his tall, imposing frame completely looming over the desk like a direct physical threat. He lifted his hand and slammed his open palm down viciously against the tempered glass, the sharp, explosive crack echoing like a literal gunshot in the tightly confined space. "Are you entirely deaf as well as crazy?" he spat, leaning in so menacingly close I could distinctly feel the damp heat of his whiskey-soaked breath brushing against my right cheek. "I told you to pick up the pen and sign the paper, and do not dare look me in the eye when I'm talking to you." The progress bar hit 100%. A tiny, brilliant green checkmark quietly appeared on my screen. The entire encrypted directory was finally mine. I slowly, deliberately, placed both of my hands flat on the cool, smooth surface of the glass desk. Then, with agonizingly slow, calculated deliberation, I raised my head. I tilted my chin sharply upward, pushing the heavy dark hair back from my face, and locked my gaze directly onto his. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into the massive leather chair. I poured every single ounce of my cold, calculated, deeply buried fury into that singular, unrelenting stare. My eyes were literal razor blades, slicing straight through the murky darkness of the office and carving directly into his shallow, arrogant soul. For a microscopic fraction of a second, profound confusion flickered across his handsome features. The woman sitting quietly before him was not trembling in absolute fear. She was not crying for mercy. She was looking at him not like a broken, defeated victim, but exactly like a professional butcher silently assessing a dead slab of meat. The grand illusion of his absolute domestic power shattered instantly, breaking into a million irreparable pieces against the impenetrable, terrifying ice in my direct stare. That unspoken realization completely destroyed him. Outrage violently and abruptly replaced his brief confusion. His face twisted into a remarkably ugly, hateful snarl as he raised his right hand, lunging aggressively forward across the wide desk to physically grab the collar of my silk robe. He never even made contact, before his outstretched fingers could even brush the delicate fabric. My left hand shot up, intercepting his thick wrist with blinding, practiced speed. I clamped down on his joint like a heavy steel vise, immediately pivoting my entire body weight sharply to the left side, using his own aggressive, uncontrolled forward momentum entirely against him. I twisted his arm sharply outward and wrenched it forcefully up high behind his shoulder blade. A choked, pathetic gasp of pure, unadulterated agony erupted forcefully from his throat as I used my right hand to grab the back of his neck, slamming his upper body face first down onto the hard, tempered glass desk. The incredibly heavy thud instantly knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. I pressed my forearm firmly and unforgivingly against the back of his neck, pinning his face securely to the freezing surface while keeping his trapped arm wrenched high enough toward the ceiling to threaten an immediate, catastrophic dislocation of his shoulder joint. He thrashed helplessly beneath my tight grip, raw panic and sheer, unadulterated terror finally replacing his drunken, arrogant rage. He was completely immobilized, realizing exactly how powerless he truly was in that fraction of a second. I leaned down slowly, lowering my mouth until my lips were hovering barely an inch from his right ear. "Wrong, sister. You bastard," I whispered, my voice a deadly, quiet, vibrating hiss in the dark room. I released my iron grip abruptly, forcefully shoving his face downward one last time against the solid glass. As he scrambled frantically backward across the floor, gasping loudly for air and desperately clutching his throbbing shoulder, I smoothly pulled the encrypted USB drive from the port, slipped my small laptop effortlessly into my waterproof bag, and walked calmly out of the office, leaving the arrogant devil choking on his own humiliating fear in the dark. The rain had finally surrendered by 6 o'clock the next morning, leaving behind a thick, suffocating humidity. We sat in a faded vinyl booth at a remarkably desolate roadside diner 40 miles outside the city limits. The air smelled of burnt filter coffee and heavy grease. Clara sat directly across from me, her hands wrapped tightly around a chipped porcelain mug, looking entirely hollowed out. I flipped open my laptop, plugging in the decrypted drive I had extracted from the mansion. Most women, when they suspect their wealthy, secretive husbands are hiding a massive double life, immediately look for the classic, pathetic cliches. They brace themselves to find explicit text messages, hidden hotel receipts, or photos of a young, blonde mistress. But as the immense volume of Julian's hidden files populated on my screen, it became terrifyingly clear that infidelity was far beneath his level of sociopathy. Julian did not have a mistress. He had a remarkably elaborate, meticulously structured financial death trap. I opened the master ledger, my eyes scanning the heavily encrypted spreadsheets. The sheer scale of his deceit was breathtaking. Julian's glamorous venture capital firm was nothing more than a bleeding, hollow shell. He was deeply underwater, facing a catastrophic liquidity crisis. But instead of declaring bankruptcy, he had decided to use his wife as a human shield. "Look at this," I told Clara, turning the screen slightly toward her. "He has been routing unauthorized capital through a series of ghost subsidiaries, but that is not the worst part." I opened a subfolder heavily guarded by a secondary firewall I had bypassed an hour earlier. Inside were hundreds of digitized loan agreements. Julian had successfully stolen Clara's complete digital identity. He had expertly forged her biometric signatures, authorized her personal accounts, and leveraged her pristine credit to secretly borrow tens of millions of dollars from highly dangerous, unregulated shadow lenders. If his corporate empire collapsed tomorrow, Julian would walk away legally clean, while the violent black market creditors would come directly for Clara. Clara stared at the screen, all the blood draining completely from her exhausted face. "He made me the sole guarantor," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He tied the entire collapse to my name." "It goes much deeper than just leaving you with his debts," I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh, clinical whisper as I opened the next set of documents. These were not financial ledgers. They were highly classified medical journals, dark web browsing caches, and legally binding digital contracts. Julian had recently purchased 3 separate, astronomically high life insurance policies, all heavily front-loaded. The insured party was Clara. The sole, uncontested beneficiary was Julian. If Clara died, the policies would pay out a combined total of $25 million in tax-free cash. The true horror, however, was neatly buried in his encrypted search history. He had not just been looking up life insurance loopholes, he had spent the last 4 months exhaustively researching potent, highly restricted synthetic sedatives. Specifically, he was looking for chemical compounds that were completely tasteless, completely odorless, and guaranteed to induce sudden, massive heart failure, while metabolizing so rapidly they would remain utterly undetectable in a standard post-mortem toxicology screening. The disabled security cameras by the pool and the stairs, the aggressive, systematic gaslighting campaign to convince all their friends she was suffering from severe psychiatric delusions. It was not just emotional abuse, it was the precise, methodical groundwork for a perfect murder. When her heart finally stopped, the authorities would simply look at her fabricated history of mental instability, note the heavy stress she was supposedly under, and rule it a tragic, natural medical event. I kept digging, my fingers flying across the keyboard, tracing the intricate web of offshore wire transfers. A highly specific, recurring alphanumeric tag kept appearing in the outgoing digital transaction logs. Project Icarus. Every single month, hundreds of thousands of dollars were being systematically siphoned from his rapidly dying company and quietly funneled into a blind trust account established deep in the Cayman Islands under that exact name. I immediately pulled out my encrypted mobile device and opened a secure, heavily masked communication channel to a former white hat hacker associate of mine who owed me a significant favor. I transmitted the routing numbers and the project name, demanding a full, deep web cross-reference scan. The response came back 20 minutes later, confirming my darkest, most cynical theory. Project Icarus was not a corporate backup fund. The Cayman Trust was directly linked to a newly minted, flawless foreign passport, a completely fabricated background history, and a heavily guarded safe deposit box in Zurich. Julian was never planning to stay and collect the insurance money as a grieving widower, the massive loans, the life insurance payouts, the fake medical records, the offshore accounts. It was all part of a single, highly orchestrated exit strategy. He was going to murder Clara, take the $25 million, abandon his heavily indebted company to collapse onto her corpse, and permanently vanish into thin air as a completely different human being. The most logical move for any normal person discovering a murder plot would have been to contact emergency services immediately and hand the decrypted laptop straight over to the federal authorities. But I knew exactly how the wealthy operated. In the brutal, highly paid world of corporate defense attorneys, digital evidence was remarkably malleable. If I took this information to the police right now, Julian's elite legal team would simply spin a masterful, entirely plausible counter-narrative. They would weaponize the very psychiatric profile he had spent the last 4 months building against Clara. They would argue confidently in front of a judge that a deeply disturbed, paranoid wife had hired a rogue hacker to fabricate the financial documents during a severe manic episode. The police would freeze the investigation in endless bureaucratic red tape, giving Julian exactly the window of time he needed to execute his violent escape plan. We did not need the police yet. We needed an inside operative. I dove aggressively back into the offshore routing data, specifically targeting the shell company acting as the primary administrator for Project Icarus. It took me exactly 3 hours of tracing dummy corporations through international firewalls to find the singular digital signature authorizing the massive wire transfers. It belonged to a woman named Elena Vance. She was the brilliant, notoriously ruthless chief financial officer of Julian's venture capital firm. According to my extensive background checks, Elena operated under the firm, unwavering belief that she was Julian's indispensable right hand. She considered herself his ultimate equal in the treacherous, male-dominated world of high finance. She honestly thought she was co-piloting the ship. She had absolutely no idea he had already packed the only parachute and rigged the engines to explode mid-flight. I sent a highly encrypted, anonymous text message directly to Elena's private secure phone, threatening to expose a massive compliance violation to the Securities and Exchange Commission if she did not meet me alone. I chose the third sub-level of an underground parking garage situated beneath a deserted commercial plaza downtown. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening when her sleek black luxury sedan rolled into the dim concrete bunker. I brought Clara with me. She needed to witness this crucial shift in power. Clara sat silently in the passenger seat of my dark vehicle, completely hidden in the shadows. Elena stepped out of her car wearing a sharp, expensive designer suit, her posture radiating pure, defensive arrogance. "Who the hell are you?" Elena demanded, her voice echoing sharply against the damp concrete pillars. "And what kind of pathetic corporate espionage game are you trying to play with my firm?" I did not say a single word in response. I simply stepped out of the shadows, walked straight up to her luxury vehicle, and violently slapped a thick stack of freshly printed banking statements directly onto the polished hood. "I am the twin sister of the woman your boss is currently planning to murder," I said coldly, watching her sharp eyes dart nervously toward the papers. "And you are the arrogant idiot he is planning to send to federal prison for the rest of her natural life." Elena scoffed loudly, crossing her arms defensively. "You are completely out of your mind. Julian and I have built this entire operation together. We are 50-50 partners in every single venture." "Read the last 3 pages," I commanded, tapping the heavy stack of paper with my index finger. "Look very closely at the proxy signatures on the shadow loans. Look at the authorized liability clauses." Reluctantly, she picked up the documents. I watched the artificial fluorescent lights reflect in her eyes as she quickly scanned the heavy legal jargon. The psychological transformation was both spectacular and utterly terrifying. The arrogant color drained entirely from her face, replaced rapidly by a sickly ashen gray. She realized exactly what I had uncovered. Julian had meticulously structured the illegal credit lines and the offshore siphoning so that every single catastrophic financial crime was legally tethered exclusively to the chief financial officer. When he vanished to Zurich with his new identity and Clara's life insurance money, the entire federal weight of the massive fraud would crash directly onto Elena's head. She was never his trusted partner. She was his designated, legally binding scapegoat. The profound silence in the underground garage was suddenly broken by a harsh, deeply bitter laugh escaping Elena's throat. Her blind corporate loyalty evaporated instantly, completely incinerated by a sudden, volcanic eruption of pure, unadulterated fury. Clara stepped out of my vehicle, the dim light catching her pale, exhausted face. Elena looked at Clara, then looked back at me, her eyes burning with a violent, unified desire for absolute destruction. "He is pitching the new tech integration fund tomorrow night at the Miami Convention Center," Elena said, her voice shaking with quiet, lethal rage. "He is expecting to close $50 million in capital from the biggest East Coast investors." "I know," I replied smoothly, "and we are going to make sure it is the most memorable presentation of his entire pathetic life. But I need unrestricted access. I need the master encryption keys to the firm's central servers. And I need complete backdoor entry into the convention center's audiovisual network." Elena did not hesitate for a single second. She reached immediately into her designer handbag, pulled out a heavy metal flash drive containing the highest level administrative clearance protocols, and placed it firmly into my hand. Right there, in the damp, echoing darkness of the concrete basement, a completely unbreakable alliance was forged. We were no longer just a terrified victim, a rogue security expert, and a betrayed corporate executive. We were a perfectly calibrated trinity of vengeance, armed with the absolute digital keys to the kingdom, fully ready to drag the devil straight down into the dirt. The grand ballroom of the Miami Convention Center was a blinding spectacle of pure, unadulterated financial arrogance. It was exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, and the sprawling venue had been transformed into a glittering temple worshipping corporate greed. Massive crystal chandeliers hung suspended from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the imported silk tablecloths and the endless towers of expensive vintage champagne. The air was thick with the scent of high-end perfume and the quiet, predatory hum of the most powerful venture capitalists on the eastern seaboard. This was Julian's masterpiece. He was standing on the precipice of securing a historic $50 million capital injection, a massive financial lifeline that would theoretically salvage his drowning company. I sat completely motionless in the center of the front row, a seating area exclusively reserved for very important guests and immediate family. I was wearing Clara's favorite dark emerald evening gown, the exact dress Julian had bought for her anniversary last year. My face was entirely obscured behind the heavy, intricately woven black mesh of a wide-brimmed designer morning hat. It was an incredibly dramatic, slightly eccentric wardrobe choice, but given the narrative Julian had spent months spinning about his wife's deteriorating mental health, a bizarre outfit would only confirm his lies to the public, to the hundreds of wealthy investors in the room. I was just the tragic, mentally unstable spouse dragged out for a final public appearance. The heavy velvet curtains parted, and Julian confidently strode onto the brightly lit stage. He looked absolutely flawless. His bespoke Italian tuxedo fit his broad shoulders perfectly, and his charismatic, blindingly white smile radiated false sincerity. He commanded the room effortlessly, holding a sleek microphone and pacing the stage with the practiced rhythm of a veteran salesman. He spoke eloquently about aggressive market expansion, disruptive technology pipelines, and guaranteed quadruple returns on initial investments within 36 months. The wealthy audience was completely mesmerized, eating directly out of the palm of his hand. Then, right on cue, his confident tone dramatically softened. He lowered his head slightly, masterfully executing the exact emotional pivot he had rehearsed 1,000 times. He needed to play the tragic hero to seal the deal. Building this visionary enterprise has been the singular journey of my professional life, Julian murmured into the microphone, his voice dripping with expertly manufactured sorrow. But as many of you in this room know, the last few months have carried a tremendous personal weight. My beautiful wife, Clara, has been fighting a severe, heartbreaking battle with her health. It has been a deeply painful chapter for our family. Her profound struggles with her psychological and physical well-being have reminded me every single day why we must push forward, why we must build a secure, lasting legacy. He placed a hand dramatically over his heart and looked down toward the front row, expecting to gesture toward an empty chair, or perhaps toward a heavily sedated, broken woman cowering under the bright lights. Instead, I slowly lifted my chin. The harsh stage lighting caught the emerald fabric of my dress. Even through the dark mesh veil, I locked my eyes directly onto his. I did not break the stare. I sat perfectly upright, radiating an absolutely chilling, undeniable strength. The physical reaction was instantaneous and magnificent to witness. Julian literally stumbled backward a half step, the expensive microphone slipping slightly in his suddenly clammy grip. The smooth, golden baritone of his voice caught violently in his throat, replaced by a harsh, deeply unprofessional stammer. To the rest of the oblivious room, it looked like a sudden wave of marital emotion, but I knew exactly what was happening behind his terrified eyes. His mind was violently short-circuiting. According to his meticulous, psychopathic timeline, the heavy dose of synthetic sedatives he had secretly mixed into her morning tea should have triggered a massive cardiac event at exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon. He had spent the entire evening believing he was officially a wealthy widower, seeing the woman he thought he had successfully murdered sitting dead center in the front row, looking like a silent, vengeful ghost, completely shattered his polished facade. A thick visible bead of cold sweat immediately broke out across his forehead. He aggressively wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his eyes darting frantically between me and the massive digital presentation screen behind him. He desperately tried to steer the conversation back to the lucrative financial projections, trying to rush the final signing protocol. He needed the investors to put their ink on the $50 million contracts right now, before the walls completely caved in. His sentences became rapid, completely disjointed, and painfully erratic. While Julian was violently unraveling under the stage lights, Elena was executing her own lethal masterpiece 2 floors above us. She was locked securely inside the venue's centralized audiovisual control room, utilizing the master administrative keys she had handed me the night before. She rapidly bypassed the convention center's primary security firewalls. In less than 60 seconds, Elena systematically severed the internal communication network, permanently locked down the digital broadcast routers, and changed every single administrative password. Down in the corporate staging area, Julian's highly paid team of information technology specialists suddenly found their screens completely frozen. They were entirely locked out of their own presentation. The digital cage was officially sealed shut. Back in the ballroom, the tension was rapidly approaching a breaking point. Julian could no longer handle the psychological torture of my unrelenting, silent gaze. He abruptly stopped mid-sentence, his chest heaving as pure panic overrode his professional instincts. He turned desperately toward the heavy-set security guards flanking the grand stage, aggressively snapping his fingers and pointing a shaking hand directly at me. "My wife is clearly unwell," Julian announced to the confused crowd, his voice cracking with undeniable, raw terror. "She is having a severe, unpredictable episode. I need security to carefully escort her out of the ballroom immediately for her own safety. Please, remove her right now." Two massive men in dark suits immediately stepped forward, reaching out to grab my shoulders. The stage was finally set for the grand finale. The moment the heavy hand of the first security guard clamped firmly onto my right shoulder, I moved. I did not shrink away in fear, and I did not physically resist him. Instead, I stood straight up, my chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. The two massive security guards immediately froze, their professional instincts telling them to stand down. I reached up with both hands and grabbed the front edge of the heavy black mesh veil. With one sharp, definitive motion, I ripped the designer morning hat completely off my head and threw it carelessly onto the empty seat beside me. I reached into my small evening clutch, pulling out a compact wireless microphone I had synchronized to Elena's master control frequency. I flicked the power switch on. The piercing feedback from the massive ballroom speakers instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. I brought the microphone to my lips, my voice echoing like thunder across the cavernous room. "You have the wrong sister again, Julian." The entire ballroom collectively gasped. A terrifying, absolute silence descended over the hundreds of elite investors, their eyes darting wildly between my face and the bright stage. Julian backed away from the transparent acrylic podium as if it had suddenly caught fire. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His jaw dropped, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to produce a single coherent sound. He desperately clutched his chest, his breathing turning into rapid, shallow gasps. The psychological shock of seeing his supposedly dead wife sitting comfortably in the front row was completely short-circuiting his brain. He was staring directly at my face, finally registering the subtle physical differences, the sharper jawline, the colder eyes, and the complete absence of the fear he had so painstakingly cultivated in his victim. Before he could even attempt to recover his composure or shout another desperate order to the confused security team, the massive 50-foot high-definition LED screen directly behind him completely blacked out. The bright, optimistic charts detailing projected quarterly revenues and $50 million investment yields completely vanished. For exactly 3 seconds, the massive ballroom was plunged into an eerie, pregnant darkness. The only sound was the collective, nervous shifting of several hundred people. Then, the screen roared back to life, flooding the stage with stark, undeniable truth. It was not a corporate presentation, it was the high-resolution, infrared security footage I had extracted from his own hidden home server. The massive screen displayed the dark interior of his private office. The audience watched in absolute horror as the towering, drunken figure of Julian lunged violently across the glass desk. They watched him attempt to physically assault the woman he thought was his wife. And then, they watched in stunned silence as I effortlessly caught his wrist, twisted his arm, and violently slammed his face directly into the heavy tempered glass. A collective wave of pure disgust rippled through the audience, but Elena, operating from the locked control room above, was far from finished. The video feed smoothly transitioned into a rapid, damning slideshow of irrefutable digital evidence. Highly magnified images of the forged loan documents filled the massive screen, clearly displaying the fraudulent electronic signatures used to secure illegal credit lines from violent shadow lenders. The screen split, showing the heavy offshore wire transfers routed directly to the Cayman Islands trust known as Project Icarus. Then came the final, most horrifying revelation. The digital display zoomed in on his encrypted search history and dark web receipts, clearly highlighting his exhaustive, methodical research into tasteless, odorless synthetic sedatives guaranteed to induce sudden, undetectable heart failure. The entire anatomy of his meticulously planned murder and massive financial fraud was completely laid bare for the wealthiest people on the eastern seaboard to witness. Julian stumbled backward, his legs suddenly giving out completely. He crashed heavily into the podium, sending his carefully organized presentation notes scattering like dead leaves across the polished stage. He desperately grabbed his own microphone, screaming wildly into it. "This is a lie. This is an elaborate deep fake. Turn the screens off right now. Someone turn the damn screens off." But the system was completely locked. The truth kept playing on an endless, unforgiving loop. The entire front row of investors, the very people who were about to hand him $50 million, physically recoiled in horror. They began rapidly packing up their briefcases, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a massive crime. Then, the final, completely insurmountable blow was delivered. The heavy velvet curtains on the far left wing of the stage parted. Out walked the real Clara. She was not wearing a morning dress, and she was not trembling. She was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored dark navy suit. Her posture was completely upright, her shoulders pulled back, and her eyes burned with a fierce, brilliant clarity that Julian had tried so desperately to extinguish. She was absolutely radiating the pure, undeniable power of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own life. She was not walking alone. Clara was flanked perfectly by 4 stern-looking federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, their golden badges gleaming brightly under the harsh stage lights. While Julian had been busy rehearsing his tragic, fake sympathy speech, I had securely transmitted the entire decrypted Project Icarus dossier directly to a senior federal prosecutor using the encrypted digital pathway Elena had established. The lead agent, a tall, powerfully built man with a completely uncompromising expression, marched directly across the polished stage floor. He did not hesitate for a single second. He grabbed Julian by the collar of his bespoke Italian tuxedo and forcefully hauled the sobbing man back onto his feet. "Julian Vance," the agent announced, his deep voice booming loudly over the silenced crowd even without a microphone. "You are under arrest for massive federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, criminal conspiracy, and the attempted premeditated murder of your wife." Julian completely shattered. The polished, charismatic visionary completely disintegrated, leaving behind nothing but a pathetic, terrified coward. He dropped to his knees, openly weeping, desperately reaching out toward the front row. He begged the investors for help. He screamed that he was a genius, that they needed his vision, that his company was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But out of the several hundred people standing in that grand ballroom, not a single soul moved a muscle to help him. They looked at him with nothing but pure, unadulterated revulsion. The grand illusion was dead. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly into place around his wrists. The sharp metallic sound echoed beautifully through the massive hall. The agents roughly escorted him down the stairs and directly out the heavy emergency exit doors, dragging the screaming, completely ruined man into the flashing red and blue lights of the dozens of federal vehicles waiting outside. The spectacular scam had collapsed entirely, saving my sister's life and ensuring the arrogant monster would spend the next several decades rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. 6 months later, the torrential storms and suffocating, oppressive humidity of Miami felt like a completely different lifetime. The air in Seattle was incredibly crisp, wonderfully cool, and filled with the scent of pine and ocean salt. I sat outside a charming, sun-drenched corner cafe, watching the bright morning light reflect beautifully off the calm, deep blue waters of the harbor. The rich, earthy aroma of freshly roasted coffee beans drifted pleasantly from the open windows. Clara sat across from me, sipping her latte with a deeply genuine, radiant smile. The hollow, exhausted shadows that had previously haunted her eyes were completely gone, with Elena's crucial testimony and the overwhelming mountain of digital evidence. The massive offshore accounts had been successfully frozen. Clara's stolen identity was fully restored, her financial ruin completely reversed, and her personal fortune legally secured. She was starting a brand new venture, completely on her own terms. She reached across the small wooden table and gently squeezed my hand. We did not need to say a single word about the man locked away in a tiny concrete cell thousands of miles away. The brilliant morning sun warmed our faces, a silent, absolute confirmation of everything we had fought to achieve. We had looked the devil straight in the eye, and we had watched him blink first. The absolute sweetest revenge was not the destruction of our enemy, but the beautiful, boundless freedom of a vibrant, brand new life. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Zoe Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.